Welcome to Liberty Law Talk. This podcast is a production of the online journal Law and Liberty and hosted by our staff. Please visit us at lawliberty.org, and thank you for listening.
Welcome to Liberty Law Talk. My name is Sam Gregg, and I'm Distinguished Fellow in Political Economy at the American Institute for Economic Research, and I'm also contributing editor at Law and Liberty, part of the Liberty Fund Network. Thanks for joining us today. Classical liberalism and classical liberal ideas have long played an outsized role in modern American politics, especially on the right. Today, however, we seem to be living through a period of retrenchment, whereby classical liberal ideas are under siege from the left, but also increasingly from the right. Economic nationalism seems to be in the ascendancy on the left and the right, and much of the American business world has lurched in the direction of what's often called stakeholder capitalism. We even find parts of the American right seemingly willing to even embrace and use something that most conservatives have at least theoretically opposed, that being the administrative state. Some national conservatives insist that classical liberals have been in the driver's seat of the American conservative movement for too long, and that it's time for them to step back. So what's happened to classical liberalism in America? Did classical liberals make mistakes in pursuing their limited government agenda? Is there a chance that the band, otherwise known as fusionism, might get back together? Are classical liberals now condemned to being friendless for a generation? What does it mean to be a classical liberal in America as the second quarter of the 21st century looms? Joining me to discuss these and related questions today is one of America's leading classical liberal economists, Dr. Veronique De Rugy. Dr. De Rugy is the George Gibbs Chair in Political Economy and Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her primary research interests include the U.S. economy, the federal budget, taxation, tax competition, and cronyism. Her popular weekly columns address economic issues ranging from lessons on creating sustainable economic growth to the implications of government tax and fiscal policies. She's testified numerous times in front of Congress on the effects of fiscal stimulus, debt and deficits, and regulation on the economy. She's the author of a weekly opinion column for the Creators Syndicate, writes regular columns for Reason magazine, and blogs about economics at National Review Online's The Corner. Her charts, articles, and commentaries have been featured in a wide range of media outlets, including Bloomberg Television, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN International, C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and Fox News. And I think it's fair to say that she is the scourge of that most crony-est of outfits, the Export-Import Bank. Vero, welcome to Liberty Law Talk.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
Vero, you've been involved in the world of classical liberal ideas in America, but also in Europe, particularly France, for a long time. And in the 1980s and 1990s, classical liberal ideas, especially about economics, I think, seemed to be in the ascendancy, right? At least at a rhetorical level. But now they are plainly on the back foot. So what, in your view, is the single biggest event or the single biggest development that's responsible for this change?
It's a very good question. If I wanted to be utterly self-centered, I would say that it seems that everywhere I go, classical liberalism loses, because obviously when I lived in France, it was not a classical liberal country. There's still a communist party. There's still a socialist party. I mean, command and control seems to be really kind of the way people think about the economy and the role of government, that most solution comes from the government. And I moved to the U.S. kind of hoping to leave all of this behind. Not that I had any illusion that the U.S. was perfect, but certainly it looked so much better. And ever since it's been in decline. So, but that I assume is more like correlation than causation. So to answer your question more seriously, I think obviously the most obvious answer is like we have either not done our job properly, or we've been ineffective at making our case, and there is something easy and appealing to the case that the government can solve all of your problems. And we have utterly failed to present our ideas in a way that actually contradict this claim in spite of the evidence. I mean, we live in a world that is abundant compared to where it should be obvious that, a market economy is the way to go. But also, I think we have probably failed to emphasize and talk to people about their real concern. So maybe we haven't talked to people at their level of concern, and we've kind of stayed in the sphere of, look, this is great, all is great, the economy is growing, we're wealthier than we are, and we have not kind of addressed people everyday concern.
Well, let's step back then and take a type of self-reflective position, which I think is what you're doing now. Do you think that classical liberals simply assumed that they had won the economic argument and they weren't paying attention to some major cultural shifts that have lent energy to those on the right and on the left who perhaps were always skeptical about markets and who never really gave up their faith in things like Keynesian economics or the different interventionist options associated with things like industrial policy? So do you think that's part of the issue, that the assumption was we've won the economic argument, therefore our major job of persuasion is over?
Yes and no. I think this is true for areas like free trade and immigration for a while. But I think kind of in the world that I've evolved in, Keynesian economics has always been much more potent and influential, for instance, than the more, I hate to say this, but more free market alternative. So I think it is true for some areas where we took things for granted because there was a consensus.
You mean something like trade, for example?
Like trade and immigration to some extent. There were some things we took for granted. We assumed we had made the case, and it was done. The thing, in my opinion, that is more puzzling about the last, let's say, 20 years and what has happened is that we see people, at least in my case, I see people who've been battling with me in the trenches against the left on central planning issues, on government intervention into our lives, on all sorts of things, who have now flipped their position and are talking about how the free market is not the answer, or it's worth overriding the allocation of the market in order to achieve a common good. And they are sounding a lot like the people they used to criticize. That, to me, is the most baffling thing. It's not that we had won and we took everything for granted. There's some of that. That's part of the story. What I don't quite understand is how you can kind of have such a reversal in beliefs. Not everyone, but in a lot of people. I mean, it's easy to say it's opportunistic, that Trump opened the door for a political opportunity, that a lot of people who actually were never that principled, but were more in the business of winning elections and trying to be in power, kind of saw and jumped into. But I think there's something more. I'm just not that cynical to think that is all that is at play.
So are you suggesting that maybe the case for markets was not as widely accepted as perhaps we assumed, that in fact things like a more or less neo-Keynesian outlook on the economy never really went away?
Well, I think it's obvious. Listen, even when I say that the case for free market like a free trade, for instance, was established, right? There were always some people who were skeptical of free trade.
Like Pat Buchanan, for example.
Yeah. No, I mean, there were always people who were, I mean, if you remember the whole debate about NAFTA, right? I mean, it really opposed two sides very violently. Two sides that I think overstated their position. Like, I mean, the outcome of, like, for instance, I do think, and you talk about this in your book, it's like, and I wrote a piece for Law and Liberty where I said a lot of the free traders at the time kind of probably overstated the impact of NAFTA. It's not that it's not a net positive one, but it's not this panacea that is going to make everything fine. And on the other hand, obviously the anti-NAFTA people were completely wrong about how horrible it was going to be and all this and all that. So it's not as if like everyone was a free trader. It's also not as if I think like the way people understood the benefit of trade was ever the correct one. I think there was an understanding that was actually profoundly mercantilist or profoundly misguided, I'll say. I don't want to put a label on it about it, where we've always kind of like said, you know what, free trade is great because it allows us to export more. And we failed to actually, because we were getting what we wanted this way. We were getting free trade agreement based on this premise, right? I think we didn't do maybe. I mean, I don't want to blame people, but we have really, it seems, failed to actually make the case that actually the real value of trade is what we import. And in fact, from an economic perspective, from a domestic perspective, export is a cost, or even just making the case that if you want to export more, you need to import much more, right? And
so we never really got away from, let's call it neo-mercantilist arguments.
I think the logic of the arguments as we were making them as a matter of, listen, we're getting what we want, which are free trade agreements, even though they're not perfect, even though the logic is misguided, but we're getting what we want, probably meant that we took things for granted that we shouldn't have done because people did not fundamentally understand what the value of trade truly is. So that's an example to kind of like minimize how far we've fallen. I think we were doing great, but maybe not for the best reasons.
Let's shift our discussion now to an angle which I think you're particularly competent to talk about with this discussion of what's happened to classical liberalism and classical liberal ideas. You have been relentless, and I mean relentless, in your critique of corporate welfare and the cronyism that's so widespread in the business sector of the United States. So is part of the challenge for classical liberalism today the fact that many business leaders don't actually like markets? They don't like competition because if that's true, if it's true that large numbers of business leaders are not really on board with the case for dynamic markets, both domestically but also internationally, that means that an incredibly influential segment of America is not, in fact, on board with market and classical liberal ideas. So do you think that this describes part of the challenge for classical liberalism today?
It is, but I think kind of our biggest challenge, right, is ultimately we live in a world that is where politics plays a big role and where the role of government is oversized, and the existence of government and its ability to actually grant favors. Unless we win and we get some sort of, constitutional amendment, like that says that no government granted privilege for the private sector no matter what, under any circumstances, is always going to be there. And I think if you marry this with the same issue as with trade, which is that people kind of saw the benefit of, at least business leaders, right? They see the benefit of a free market, but they actually don't think about what actually makes it work. And that basically, when they're given an opportunity to actually get a government granted privilege, meaning a subsidy, a monopoly rent, a tax break that the competitors are not getting, they take it. And they take it because it's beneficial to them, it's available to them, they answer to their shareholders, and they maybe not at a fundamental level understand how this behavior in and of itself feeds a dislike for capitalism, for lack of a better word, free market.
Whereas what really is operating here is a type of mercantilist outlook.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And there's no way of, and in fact, kind of one of the most detrimental and problematic aspect, I think, of cronyism, corporate welfare, government granted privilege, however you want to call it, is precisely that because the government tends to benefit and grant privilege to larger, more connected political companies that may actually, in most cases, not actually need it at all, but like it because who wouldn't want to kind of have better terms for your loans? It feeds this idea, right, that the wealthy and the corporations are the enemy. I mean, if you go back to the Occupy movement during the Great Recession, I mean, these guys were great. They were right about kind of sensing that there's a real problem of a government that is effectively, letting everyone being crushed, but saving a bunch of big banks, having sheltered big banks for like a while, and now they're being saved. The airlines are being bailed out, and it gives this perception, right, that there's this corruption going on. Of course, the things that people mostly don't see is that you don't cure this kind of behavior with more government, or more importantly, in my opinion, that these behaviors only exist because of the government ability to grant this privilege.
Right, which is essentially Adam Smith's point in The Wealth of Nations in his critique of mercantilism. So, Vero, we've been talking about the economic side of what's happened with classical liberalism, and we've touched on some of the politics. Here's a question for you, which is a little different, and that is, do you think that there are things on the cultural side, cultural developments in America, that classical liberals have neglected when they're making their arguments about limited government and markets and all these sorts of things? Are there things on the cultural side that they've largely neglected to their cost now?
Well, I mean, not just on the cultural side, even on the economic side. Actually, your book was, strangely enough, an eye-opener for me. There's this one sentence that I just actually wrote about a column about, just this one sentence in your book, which is to actually remind people that economists really make a terrible case for the free market, for what the free market does. And we make it in terms that are as if kind of the price system is the beginning and the end of absolutely everything. When in fact, what is actually beautiful about the free market is all the institutions that exist to support it underneath, that are necessary, that are conducive to actually great cooperation between strangers and good behavior, really, between strangers. So that's I think is an issue. It's like we economists talk about the market and the price system in ways that sometimes are counterproductive. Like instead of talking about competition as this cutthroat thing, what we should actually highlight, at the very least occasional, is an incredible cooperation that is enabled by a market economy. I think on the cultural side, I think we have, and I wonder whether it's because a lot of the free market movement is actually made of economists. And so the cultural aspect of this kind of defense for a market economy just totally ignore the cultural side And I think, for instance, like you and I have talked about this in the past, I think that we have utterly placed so much emphasis on the market that we have actually forgotten that as important are like notion of communities, usually underpinned by civil society, which is civil society is the way that we help one another basically outside of the market, right? There's the market ways to do this, but there are also like there are communities and there are ways that people actually do good for one another, support one another, feed one another. I mean, the market helps because it provides wealth to support these activities, but it goes way beyond. I mean, civil society is such an important thing that we should constantly be kind of, cherishing. And instead, I think we've overlooked it at great cost, in my opinion.
So you think classical liberals should be saying more about the civil society side of things? So all these associations, communities that are not the state, but they're also not economic associations either.
And think about it this way, right? So again, I think that the fact that so much of our community, of our kind of community of classical liberals are made of economists, I think kind of basically puts forward this individualistic kind of side of a market economy, right? It leads to cooperation, and even though no one plans it, Paris gets fed, and all that stuff. But we have, at least let me talk for myself. I have neglected for about 2 decades the importance of communities and the role they play in people's flourishing. And it's not for lack of having read, like I've read David Bedo's, I don't know how you pronounce his name's book on, all these welfare institution that existed outside of the government. I mean, I should know better. I mean, I find stories like this incredibly inspiring, but I think in my own thinking, I haven't focused enough on the importance of communities.
So we've talked about the past and we've talked a little bit about the present. I'd like to now shift our conversation towards the future and what might lay ahead for classical liberals and classical liberals' ideas. So this isn't the first time in history, right, that classical liberal ideas have been somewhat marginalized. I mean, imagine living in the 1920s or 1930s as a classical liberal. I suspect it was a very, very lonely time. So what do you think might be the opportunities for classical liberals to advance some of their ideas in the current conditions? Are classical liberals, in a sense, are they basically condemned to wait for a crisis to come along and then seize the opportunity? Or are classical liberals looking for a more piecemeal approach? In other words, winning skirmishes here and there, rather than waiting for a massive catastrophe to happen, to which they will then step in with solutions?
So I don't think that catastrophes are the way to go for us. Because when people are scared, when people feel poor, they turn to the government. So I'm not super optimistic that our moment is going to come about because of a crisis.
Well, that's what happened in the financial crisis, right? Remember, everyone turned to the state.
I mean, it's what's happened during COVID. This happens a fair amount, and the government grows during emergencies, and they tend to stay grow. I mean, at least in the last 20 years, I'd say that's definitely the case. I do think that our only way of doing this, first, we need to regroup. I think we need to talk to one another more. The battle of ideas ultimately is going to be the solution to our problem. Besides, I don't know what else we can do. And I think we're going to have to take stock of what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I was actually thinking about this, and I'm writing something about this right now. It's like, I think that we've overlooked the importance of economic growth in our lives. And I think we haven't explained to people enough kind of how ultimately it's not just like focusing on economic growth. It's not just like a sound economic case, but it's actually an incredible, important moral case that with economic growth, you don't just lift everyone up out of poverty, especially poor people, but it also, you actually promote a lot of the values that we want in society, like a liberal order, tolerance, peace, all of these things. And I feel like we have definitely grown much less at a much slower pace in the last 20 years. And I don't think we've kind of been alarmed enough about that fact, because that is working absolutely against us. But I think ultimately we need to make the case. We need to be very careful not to oversell a lot of our solutions. So, I mean, I mentioned NAFTA. We did kind of like probably oversell the benefit of NAFTA. I'm still a big supporter of NAFTA. I mean, it was just, there's no question in my mind that it was extremely important and beneficial. I'm worried that kind of like there's a trend in our movement to kind of oversell, like the benefits of technology and supply side reforms. They're very important, right? I mean, I think they're extremely important to produce growth, but I think we all have to recalibrate and kind of find a way to talk to people about what they really care about.
Right, because when we talk about economic growth, we often talk about GDP, we talk about living standards and things like this, all of which is good. But that's also a quite materialistic way of approaching it.
Yeah, but I think we need to focus on the moral aspect, the non-economic aspect. You get more safety, you get more clean environment, you get more tolerance, more peace. There are liberal values that these liberal values just do not happen in stagnant economies. They don't. In fact, stagnant economy, they breed resentment. They breed trying to look for a scapegoat. They breed the kind of a lot of what we're seeing right now about the fear of others, blaming others. So I think we need to make a much better case to actually talk about all these things we care about and put them in the context of things that actually really matter to people. And I think we need to do a better job for whatever reason. It baffles me it constantly baffles me. Government fails all the time, a lot, at a scale that's enormous. I don't know if you read the story about the high-speed rail in California.
Yes.
Right? Typical case of industrial policy, government intervention, hubris. Even the French bureaucrats at la SNCF, the engineers were like, we're leaving. Like, we're going to Africa to build a bullet train because this is too politically dysfunctional. This happens all the time. And yet people fail to hold the government responsible, or actually to remember that maybe it should make us more skeptical about using the government for everything. And this is what baffles me the most about the new right to give it, to use this,
the sheer degree of government failure we can point to, and yet many people who describe themselves as new right or national conservatives or whatever this new grouping is called, they don't seem willing to acknowledge.
But it's bizarre.
Government fails again and again.
A lot of these people were our friends fighting with us against government intervention precisely because they understood government fails. So that was kind of that's kind of interesting to me. But to their credit, I think they are doing what maybe we failed to do. And that is to actually point out that there are truly things that are not working. When you look at areas in the US where there's high unemployment rate, low wage, and people are stuck there, and unlike what we've seen in the past in these type of contexts, people would go, or they would train and get another job. They would leave. They would go somewhere else to find. People aren't doing this anymore. I mean, they're like groups, and we tend to actually talk in aggregate. Well, on net, everyone's better. On net, everyone's better. And it is true. On net, everyone is better, right? And we're significantly, even those people in the Rust Belt, they all have, TVs and iPhones and all of that stuff. But once you've said that, you've accomplished nothing, because those goods and that kind of level of wealth is your new baseline. So we are not talking about these specific problems. We've kind of ignored them.
So we need to move from the aggregate to the regional and local, in a sense.
Yeah, and prove, like, for instance, it's like I look at these areas and it's it's heartbreaking, but I can kind of name you 10 things that the government has actually done to get people stuck there, right? But I mean, if I don't ever talk about these areas, right, then I've allowed basically the narrative of the market has failed these people to kind of basically to take over.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our conversation, and I'd like to conclude by asking you a somewhat different question. So, classical liberals, they have their pantheon of intellectual heroes. So in more recent times, they would be people like F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, James Buchanan, for example. But there are also others who go back a few centuries and were, of course, primarily English, Scottish, and Western European. So my question for you, which we're going to conclude, is who is for you the classical liberal thinker from the past that classical liberals need to be looking to today for inspiration? Now, I have some ideas, but I'd be interested in hearing, who do you think would be someone who can inspire classical liberals in the somewhat gloomy environment of today?
Frédéric Bastiat.
Bastiat.
I mean, there are many. By the way, you know why we're so attached to people of the past, to scholars of the past, to intellectual of the past? And this is one of our challenges, because there are no new ideas. I'm always annoyed when people say, well, can you come up with new ideas? Well, actually, there are not a lot of new ideas out there. Maybe there are different ways to do things. Right at the margin, you can do things differently. You can kind of have a different messenger, have a different message, use a different medium. But when it comes to the arguments for freedom, the argument for classical liberalism, honestly, all the cases have already been made. But one person who I think actually does a remarkable job with a lot of humor is Bastiat. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Adam Smith, and I like that some people can find it unbelievably boring, right? I think Bastiat has it all. And this is not any like instinct, like chauvinistic instinct that actually gets me to say this, because I will say the first time I read Bastiat, I read it in English, because like the French totally ignore Bastiat. But I think that it's like we can take a page of the way he was fighting these battles. And he was funny. He had always concrete examples. He was kind of challenging people, the way they think, and while at the same time making some incredibly profound arguments about the law. By the way, Bastiat, before Hayek, right, talked about the difference between legislation and the law, like how these are two separate things. So I guess I want to put a plug for Bastiat.
Bastiat is, of course, as you know, buried in l'Église Saint-Louis de Francais in Rome. You can actually go and stand there and look at his grave. And the fact that he's buried there, I think, is indicative of someone who thought very widely, obviously, about economics and the movement for liberty, but also some of the deeper traditions which he clearly believed in formative.
Yeah, and if I can add something, one of the things that we are missing very often when we talk about these intellectuals of the past who are very inspirational, who have actually kind of put out in books like Truth that are just like that we're still using to this day, it's like we kind of omit that I think the baseline for all of them was a standard for morality that may be actually kind of different than the one we have today.
Right. They sort of believed in moral absolutes.
So we pick and choose what we want, but we kind of ignore that overall environment where the arguments were taking place, that they were things that were taken for granted, that we don't take for granted anymore. And I think we tend to pick and choose. So I think this is kind of a warning about kind of using, writers of the past selectively without kind of acknowledging some of the most profound facts about them.
Dr. Veronique De Rugy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Liberty Law Talk, in which we've been discussing what happened to classical liberalism with one of America's leading classical liberal economists, Veronique De Rugy. This podcast is available here at the Law and Liberty website and all good podcast sites like Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Podchaser. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a 5-star rating to encourage more people to join us each month. I'm Samuel Gregg for Law Liberty Talk. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk. Be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please visit our journal at lawliberty.org.